How can architects work smarter, not harder? Hi, my name is Marcin Wojciech-Żebrowski and welcome to the newest episode of Urbcast, my podcast about architecture, urbanism and many more. Before I jump to the description of this episode, I just wanted to address the current situation in Ukraine. And I'm doing that because I decided to publish this episode. I decided to keep the schedule of the episodes I recorded for my podcast. But I'm also extremely concerned, saddened, devastated, and overwhelmed by what is currently happening in Ukraine. And in here, I also wanted to share all my prayers, my support with people in Ukraine, with my friends who are still in Ukraine, and also to those who left Ukraine. I also need to say that I am extremely proud of my home country, which is showing the enormous support. And I am very, very proud of Poles who are welcoming the refugees from Ukraine and welcoming more than 100,000 people right now. And of course, it's obviously extremely overwhelming and devastating, but I hope that this situation will change and end very soon. And then you will be, of course, able to come back to this episode and listen to that once you're in mood for doing that. And yes, since I decided to publish this new episode, I think that it is now a good time to make the introduction to this newest episode, even though it might feel a bit different this time. And today I wanted to focus on working smarter, not harder as architects. And the reason for that is that I created this business development and communication series in architecture in this podcast. And this episode is a part of this as well, because we will be talking about business development, but also about the efficiency of work of an architect. And my guest today is Tyler Suomala. Tyler is business developer at Monograph, which is a team made up of architects, landscape architects, designers, and technologists focused on building tools for the architecture, engineering, and construction businesses. Their main question, their main idea was, why wasn't there a solution that could help architects manage their firms more effectively with more transparency? So the role of Tyler is to talk with a lot of architects and collect their feedback about what is the struggle in their work and how their work could be simplified and allowed to reach better results with working smarter and not harder. Tyler has obtained his education in architecture from the University of Michigan and from Princeton University. He worked in large firms, small firms, and ran his own practice prior to shifting to a focus on business and practice operations. So today, in this series of communication and business development in architecture that I created some time ago, I would love to introduce you to Tyler's experience, Tyler's work, and also Tyler's perspective on architecture and on how can we work in this field better. Now, since we're just starting our conversation on this very interesting topic, I just wanted to say hi and welcome, Tyler.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to be here.
I'm just very happy to talk to you because we're going to focus on architecture work, but not in a sense of designing magnificent and beautiful renderings and so on. Of course, this is also a part of architecture, but I hope that we can have this more, this business perspective and this business angle towards architecture, as I think that this is something that should have a bit more of coverage in general. But I just wanted to start on this more personal note and just say that you are graduated as an architect with this design hands-on experience, but now you're also developing your career more towards this business development side. And you are actually, which I really like, you help architects work smarter, not harder. Uh, what was the main inspiration behind this?
Well, I don't think it's any secret. I don't know if I've ever come across an architect in my life, now being in architecture for over a decade, that doesn't work extremely hard. So I feel like it's never the issue that the architect isn't necessarily working hard enough. It's usually that there's kind of a tunnel vision issue, right? Where they're highly focused on one or two things in particular and forgetting maybe the other half of things that could be important, right? Because we follow passion, we might have a passion for design. And so we get really enveloped in the design aspect of architecture and we forget about the business side, for example, or bringing in projects or finding projects that we actually enjoy working on. So the concept behind working smarter, not harder is this idea of maybe diversifying our attention a little bit and improving skills in other factors in the hopes that it actually brings a lot more joy and passion to the work that we're already doing.
And you say it from your own experience, right? Because you've been also an architect yourself. So you've been designing, you've been spending probably a lot of time working hard in a studio. And how did it affect you, influence you?
Yeah, I've worked in small firms. I've worked in large firms. I have 2 degrees in architecture, and I've run my own practice. There's never enough time in the day. It's like generally the feeling usually when you're either working for yourself or working in an office, there's always so many things to do. For me, I also didn't have the ability to basically do what I'm encouraging people to do now, which is to kind of diversify my attention. I didn't really have that ability myself. So it took me kind of taking a tangential step outside of architecture to have more of a macro level view of, everything that envelops architecture and running a practice and working in architecture and having a career in architecture, to now understand all these different aspects and hopefully influence architects to focus more on these other aspects so that they can ideally find a lot more joy, in what they're doing on a daily basis.
Was there any particular moment for you that you kind of experienced or developed this broader vision on architecture, a moment that was kind of a breakthrough moment when you realized that there is a lot more than only designing, that there is all this communication, PR, business, and not only part of the profession?
Yeah, there's kind of 2 parts where that happens, right? One is it smacks you right in the face the second that you start a practice, right? I mean, it's kind of unavoidable. You quickly realize that there's a lot of other aspects to architecture outside of just designing. So you're asking yourself, where am I going to get work? Is this work that I want to be doing? What's my system for deciding whether or not this is a good project for me to take on or not? Whether I have the knowledge and capabilities and experience to take this project on? So that kind of hits you right away. And then, a couple of months in, you realize, okay, wait, how am I tracking my finances? How am I making sure that I'm making money or tracking my time? So they're kind of unavoidable the second that you decide to start a practice. So that was the first jump into it. As a solo practitioner, it wasn't like a heavy hit. I could kind of like guide myself into it a little bit better. But when I eventually when I closed my practice and then jumped on to Monograph, which is where I'm at now, working on the business development team at Monograph, that's when I actually got to focus. And in my role at Monograph, I'm basically doing outreach to architects on a daily basis, architects and architecture firms on a daily basis, and talking with anywhere from 10 to 20 architects a day, typically, having conversations about their practice, what things they're struggling with, where their challenges are at, what things they're happy with. Having those conversations has been just extremely beneficial for me to understand what the pain points are for architects, what things they're generally, what they want to be focusing on, and then what is, pulling their attention away from those things. That was really kind of an incredible opportunity. I'm thankful to be working at Monograph because it's such an incredible company. And they really are focused on improving practice operations just industry-wide. I mean, it is kind of in a way like a tunnel vision focus on helping architects improve their business and financial health, which is amazing.
I really liked your LinkedIn post because you summarize very well those many conversations that you have with architects. You show that the common struggles that they have. And here I also wanted to ask about your struggles and expectations that you had while creating your own practice, because I can assume you maybe had this colorful vision for your own practice and then the reality happened. What was kind of the hardest challenge you were faced with?
That's a really good question. Yeah, it is always, you kind of always do think the grass is greener on the other side, right? So
yeah.
The reason that I had chosen to start my own practice was there was a few things that went into it. One was that I just didn't really feel that fulfilled in any position that I had at another architecture firm. Doesn't mean that I didn't enjoy certain aspects of it or that I wasn't learning a lot and gaining knowledge from the people around me, which I think is probably the most like beneficial part of working in an office. But I just I just wasn't enjoying it very much. And so I thought, I think as many people do, I should just start my own practice and then I'll have full control over everything, right? You quickly realize you don't necessarily have control over that much more, maybe a little bit more. I think the hardest part for me, there was two parts that were really hard. One was finding projects that I wanted to actually work on. And this is really difficult because even if you do research and look into it, generally what you find is that a lot of the architects that are super well known that we learn about in school, for example, right, that we learn about in school, they didn't even get discovered necessarily, like start getting recognized until they were much later on in their life, like toward the end of their career sometimes. And so, that had me thinking like, I do not personally like want to do projects that I don't have a passion for the next 20 years, just so that hopefully I get, recognized and discovered and given creative freedom, after that point. It's just not something that seems worth it to me. So that was a struggle that I had consistently throughout it. The other struggle was realizing that was basically time management. And I'm not a person that generally struggles with time management. I'm pretty on top of it. I am like an organized person. In school, for example, I typically would finish my studio projects at least a day early. Like I would plan for that to happen so that I would have time to make up for things.
Or to sleep.
Or to sleep, exactly, to sleep. And I was married throughout most of my education, at least fully throughout my graduate education and for the last year of my undergraduate education. So it was important to me not to be in studio all the time. So I had to be good at time managing or at managing my time. But with running my own practice, the difficulty wasn't necessarily working all of the time, but it was in my head knowing that there was always work to be done. And that's like a really challenging state to be in my opinion, is to take a weekend off, but know all of the things that have to happen when Monday starts. And this happens, in every role that we're in, whether we're working for someone or whether we're working for ourselves, this happens. But I think it hits at a different level when you're the sole person that's responsible for the things that need to get done. And you have a family that you're trying to support as well. It becomes a little different.
I'm pretty sure you are not alone in this struggle. You were not alone in this struggle. I also talked to many architects, and sometimes the workload is never ending, and you are spending your whole days and afternoons, evenings, and even weekends in the studio, just only to have 1 or 2 days off and then jump on the roller coaster again.
Yeah.
And of course, it is manageable, I guess, if you have a good system for that. And also, this is why I wanted to have this conversation with you, to share some useful advice for architects on how to work smarter, not harder. And also, before we dive deeper into this topic, I was very, very curious about your transition from being kind of actively designing architect into more of this business developer role. Don't you now miss a bit this kind of creative character aspect or vibe of being, an architect? It's a kind of renowned profession, right?
Yeah, maybe more so in Europe than it is in the United States. I don't know. But I think there's two ways to answer that. One is that what I kind of realized was that the other internal struggle that I was having just throughout my entire architecture career, up until really when I hit my time at Monograph, but basically the time where I was working as an architect or practicing as an architect, the struggle that I had was that I wasn't feeling as much joy as I had during my architectural education. I loved school. I loved studio. I loved taking all those classes. I loved doing my own design projects. The issue was that the second that you leave university, the second that you graduate, you realize that you're no longer designing for yourself anymore. You're either designing for a client, you're designing for your supervisor or your boss. You're fulfilling other people's creative visions and not so much your own, right? It's a little bit more split. It's not entirely yours. It's not entirely theirs. It's falling somewhere in the middle. And I really struggled with that. Like without, you kind of takes away, there's something misleading that happens in architecture education, right? Where you spend the majority of the time kind of developing your own design language only to graduate and realize that you don't actually get to use really much of any of that immediately, at least, because you're fulfilling what other people want. So from that standpoint, I don't necessarily miss doing client work. No, I don't necessarily miss, fulfilling other people's visions. If anything, it's kind of freed up my mind to go back to closer to what it was like during school, where I can actually focus my design energy on things that are interested to me. And I know that sounds a little bit selfish, but I just realized that was what brought me the most joy, was kind of developing that design language. So to lose the aspect of it where I'm doing it for clients didn't really hit me that hard, because now I'm thinking, I have more energy that I can focus on if I want to do this for friends or family. I can still do that. And I find a lot more joy out of doing that rather than bringing in other clients. The other aspect is that I actually don't feel as though I've sidelined my creative energy in any way. I'm not using it necessarily to design buildings or design spaces or environments anymore, but in my opinion, I'm just as much using it to develop relationships, to guide conversations, to speak with the right people at the right companies. It's a different kind of, it's a different path of that creative energy, but it still feels very creative to me. So I do enjoy that.
So it was a transition. Also, you've mentioned before education, right? Spending a lot of time in the studio, and then after you graduate, you are kind of met with this real market, with the real work, so to say. And many people might be disappointed if it comes to the lack of the power in their design language, or maybe making very repetitive tasks.
Yeah.
For example, what I'm missing a bit is that during the studies, we've been doing a lot of presentations, and I love pitching and presenting, and I also didn't have a lot of that once I started having some jobs. And there might be different things for different people. And in general, I wanted to ask, because there are different stories of different architects, right? You've also mentioned that some of them are kind of being discovered in their late career, in their late 50s, maybe even 60s. And you also have your own experience of almost or over 10 years of experience from this architecture field. And I was curious about your overview on architects, because you've been saying that they are often overworked and underappreciated, highly educated but poorly compensated, and very devoted and badly supported. And I just wanted you to develop these thoughts a bit, because I was just wondering if it's so bad all the time.
Yeah, I don't know if it's so bad all of the time, but I don't think it's any secret that the industry has a lot of room to improve. And I guess I can't speak globally about it. I mean, it seems like more of a global issue. I can only speak, from the standpoint of my own personal experience, but it also seems to be relatively shared when I speak with, classmates and friends and colleagues that are still working in architecture. But again, architects work extremely hard, and I personally don't think that they're very valued for it. They don't get paid super well, especially relative to other careers that have similar amount of experience. I mean, if you think to become a licensed architect, right, you essentially have to go to school for almost the same amount of time as a doctor. And from that standpoint, I walked out of my master's degree and received an offer that was less than $50,000 a year, which is kind of crazy to me, that you can have that much education. And I was working at a great, well-known firm. That was just what the going rate was at that time. So, I think things like that are super unfortunate, because it's not like I or any of my colleagues worked arguably, at entry-level positions, or not necessarily entry-level, but just early career positions. You're probably doing more work than anyone else in the office at that point. So, that part's difficult, and you don't get paid well. You work long hours. And I think a lot of firms still struggle with putting together reasonable benefits packages, for their employees, paid time off or healthcare or 401ks, these little things that I think really make a difference in the well-being of their employees. So it's not so much that the work itself, I think everyone has a different perspective on what joy they are able to achieve from the work that they're doing. And it's not that I wasn't enjoying the work that I was doing, but I think these other aspects of it play a huge part in your experience of architecture. And those were the ones that were really painful to me. I don't enjoy working long hours. I don't particularly enjoy not being paid well, right? I mean, I don't know who does. I mean, you can say that you're willing to do it for a certain period of time, but I'm not personally willing to do that for a decade and work long hours so that eventually I can make a reasonable salary and support my family. That just doesn't seem worth it to me.
Exactly. I'm wondering, isn't that at some point you have to make this decision? Either you are devoting almost everything, your personal life, to architecture, and you work hard, and you might expect to develop your career almost equally successful as the energy that you put into that. Or you don't want to sacrifice your personal life to your profession, to architecture, to work, but rather you want to keep this good balance, which might result in lack of these great possibilities in your career afterwards. Do you think that it is important to make this decision? And is it only those two options, or there is something else?
That's a really good question. What I would say is that it's unfortunate that it's a question that has to be asked, or that it's a decision that has to be made, would be the way to say that, right? Like that's super unfortunate. And I think it's more true than it is not. Obviously that's not an all-encompassing statement, but I think that's mostly true. You have to decide, it's no secret that most architects network, with other architects. I mean, the majority of my friends are still other architects. Thankfully, I married outside of architecture. My wife is not an architect, which I think has been actually extremely beneficial for me. But I mean, we all have friends that are married to other architects. These are architect couples, architect relationships. So it's not uncommon that after you're in it, you kind of develop relationships, develop your network only within architecture, which is, I think, good and bad. I mean, it's good that we have other people that we can, continue to grow and learn from. But it also, I think, contributes to the fact that architecture obviously struggles with a little bit of autonomy in the sense that we don't reach out that often. We don't like to break the barriers of architecture and bring other people in as a general rule. So that makes that part difficult. In terms of whether you have to make that decision early on or whether that's a decision that you have to make, you might be right. I personally made the decision that I was going to prioritize my personal life and my personal relationships, and that 100% contributed to my decision to eventually, close my practice and try to find career, like some kind of tangential career, some kind of tangential use of my architecture degree. So, that definitely played a part in it, but it is still unfortunate that is a decision that we have to even discuss. It shouldn't be necessary, but it kind of is.
The reason I ask this question is that I often hear about people who started their architecture career, but after some time, no matter the kind of the motivation, but they shift their job a bit, even though it might be still in architecture, because we have a vast palette of possibilities out there, right? We will discuss in a second more of this business development approach. There is many possibilities in PR, in media, in marketing, but there are also some other professions which are quite close to architecture, like some user experience or some graphic design. And many people shift their jobs towards those professions which are still quite tied to architecture. Do you think that this might be a good solution? So you kind of stay still in this design environment, but maybe you are just trying to do something else. So you kind of resign from this architecture and design part, but you can still work creatively in the kind of a broader perspective.
Yeah, I think it really just depends on what your interests are, right? I, as in everyone else that kind of, is looking at alternative careers of architecture, also came across UX design. And I don't know if you're connected with like the Architechy community at all. There's a Slack channel that you can join where it's basically a collection of architects or ex-architects that have moved on or are looking to move on to different careers in the tech industry. And the majority of them are looking at UX design. I realized because of what I was telling you earlier that was actually going to still help me have the same issue that I was having in architecture, which is that I'm going to be designing for other people and not so much for myself. So it's still the same like client relationship, fulfilling someone else's vision, a little bit of that mix. So I realized that was going to be a common struggle basically in any design career. Unless I want to be, an artist, which would be, I shouldn't say that because I'm sure that they still have to, there's still a little bit of give and take. There's give and take in any creative, profession, but maybe less so in that one. But what I would say is that I think architects have an incredible amount of knowledge and experience and skills that they gain both in school and in practice. And I would encourage them to look beyond just other design professions. Because we do have, I know that we're going to jump into business development in a little bit, but like when you think about your experience in architecture, like you were just talking, you kind of missed pitching in school. That's an incredible, like the skills that we gain throughout our career in architecture they're so vast. They're so vast. And I think it's such an incredible education for that reason. And I think it's super unfortunate that the majority of people that graduate with a degree in architecture choose to work in architecture, because I don't necessarily think that's not always the best path, obviously. But I just mean that because I think that there's so many other skills that are gained in an architecture education that can be used and sometimes even more valuable in other avenues. And we shouldn't be afraid to pursue those and acknowledge the fact that an architecture degree is kind of all encompassing in a way where you really do learn so many different skills. And architecture is not the only way to kind of find value in those skills that you gain and learn.
I couldn't not agree on that because I have many friends, architects, and their ability to solve problems and to put the puzzle pieces together or have this very kind of creative way of thinking. I think it's just brilliant, and it might be so useful in different fields as well. And here now, since we know that we are rather very educated people with a vast palette of skills, I wanted to ask this kind of big question of our conversation, of our episode. How could we shift towards working smarter and not harder? And of course, one part of it is this whole business development part, right? That we should focus on promoting our work and then getting the project that give us not only a satisfaction, but also good money. But maybe just first to start with the big question, how to work smarter, not harder as an architect.
Yeah, it's really a question of efficiency, right? It's like, how can we work more efficiently, or how can we direct our energy in the right way? And it depends on who you're talking to. But to me, what I would want to encourage architects to do basically is to direct their energy towards things that are going to bring them the most joy and the most passion in the work that they're doing. So the first step in that, right, is finding work that you enjoy and taking on projects that you enjoy, which is so much harder said than done. It's a constant struggle, I think, and every architect has come across this. Every firm, every practice has come across this decision where it's like, this project is actually one that would be really helpful for us financially, but we don't have much desire to do it, or we might not be the right fit for it. These are common questions that we come across frequently. But I'd like to just lay the foundation by saying, I think everyone defines business development a little bit differently, right? And I would personally define it as any activity that is meant to drive revenue for your firm. Now, within that, you're going to have, a lot of different parties. You're going to have people that are basically just focused on the revenue part. Like, I'm going to take on any project that I can as long as it's going to bring revenue into the practice, right? I personally feel like there's more of an art to it, like I was just saying. I think you want to develop these methods in a way that you are focusing your energy, focusing your time on work that you're passionate about, on finding work that you're passionate about, and then on bringing those projects in. I think there's a lot to that. But what I've recently realized, basically since switching over to the tech side and since switching over to business development, kind of realized that business development skills in the hands of most architects, I think, would be extremely beneficial. And I say that assuming that most architects haven't realized that they actually have really great business development skills, right? And they haven't unearthed them yet. But just taking a little bit of time to gain some skills in selling, for example, which is a word that we don't like to use, right? Architects don't like to talk about the idea that they're like selling their work or selling their practice. But if you're an architect, you are a salesperson. I don't want to like break your heart and say that, but it's totally true. And if you're not a salesperson, then you're not going to last super long if you can't sell your project, if you can't sell an idea to a potential client. And it shouldn't be a scary word. It's kind of like this taboo word, like we're afraid of selling it because I think there's kind of a cloud around the term of like a salesperson, right? This idea that it's something that's disingenuous, which I think is maybe more of a carryover of what it used to be. That might have been true 30 years ago. I don't think it's necessarily true today. It's really about finding the right solution with the right people. That's essentially what it is. You don't want to try to push. It's never about trying to push someone into something that they don't need or that they don't want. It shouldn't be, at least. So you have so many sales skills that are probably buried, somewhere in your skill set as an architect. But like you were talking about, in architecture school, we go through that and we're constantly pitching our ideas to our professors and to the jury and to our fellow classmates, basically trying to get their buy-in on our ideas, right? I mean, that's what you're doing on a consistent basis. And you do the same thing when you start practicing, whether you're working for someone or whether you're working for yourself. You're either trying to get your supervisor to buy in on this idea that you have, or you're trying to get a potential client to buy in an idea that you have. So you carry these skills all the way through. And what I've since learned since jumping into business development is that there's ways that you can guide that conversation, right? So that you can position yourself to be the best solution to the problem of the client. And I don't mean that in a disingenuous way. You want to guide the conversation so that you can discover what the actual problem is. Like, what is the problem that the client is actually having so that you can speak their language and so that you can actually solve what that problem is and ensure that you are the right solution to that problem.
I like when you mentioned that we really want to avoid the word selling, right? We are not selling, we are proposing. But in a way, business development is just selling. It's just selling the service. It's just selling hours of your practice to use this creative capacity. And I think that you laid it out perfectly, that it is kind of selling. It's outreaching. It's pitching for potential customers. But to put it in a nutshell, it is selling architecture. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, it is. You're selling architecture. You're selling your time. You're selling your services. You're selling your knowledge in the hopes that someone will buy it. And ideally someone that you actually, want to work with, or a project that you actually want to work on. So I just think that I think that as architects, we shouldn't be afraid of that term. That's something that we're doing, and it's okay. And it's not disingenuous. And you're truly trying to make sure that you are solving the right solutions for the right people and for the right companies.
From a business development perspective, if you are an architecture firm or a solo entrepreneur or solo architect, or both actually, solo entrepreneur architect, and you are having some type of a project that you especially like, what would be kind of your advice to those architects, to those firms, to try to find the work they are passionate about? Because sometimes probably the market possibilities are tight, right? And you might not find your ideal project. So would you have any advice in terms also of kind of directing your energy towards the project that you would like to get to your office?
So I think there's a lot of truth to what you're saying, right? To the alternative example, which is that sometimes you might have to take on work that you don't necessarily want to, right? And we want to minimize the amount of times that happens, because we can't ultimately, you can't always control what's happening in the economy or what's going on. There might be times that you have to take on projects that you don't necessarily want, but hopefully even those projects can be a little bit closer to something that you're passionate about. I think there's two parts to that. One is that you really have to define what types of projects and what types of people you want to work with. That's so important. And I don't think that there's not enough architects, and especially small architecture firms, that have actually done this. They might define themselves as, a residential architect or a small commercial architect, but there's so many different types of residences. There's so many different types of businesses that you can work for. I do really think it's important to niche down and decide, figure out what it is, what types of projects that you believe you're best at, that bring you the most joy, and that deliver you clients that you really enjoy working with as well. So that's the first thing. You really have to define, who you want to work with and what type of projects you want to work on. And you might not know that yet. I should be clear. You might not know that yet, which I think is okay. I mean, I was still testing that out when I started my practice. I did a little bit of residential and I did a little bit of commercial and was trying to figure out what that is. But I still think that even if you are in a phase where you're figuring it out, you should define it so that you can either qualify or disqualify that definition that you've made. And you can consistently go back to that on a regular basis, monthly, quarterly, check back in on those lists of items that are important to you to make sure that you're basically coming up with, it's almost like a mission statement for potential work is what it is really. Like these are the types of projects, and problems and people that I want to work for and that I want to work on. So that's the important thing. The other thing is that when you do find yourself in a position where you're working on a project that you really enjoy, is that you have to analyze that project, right? What is it about this project that I'm really enjoying? Is it the client? Is it the work itself? Is it the freedom that I was given in the design? Is it the type of work? Is it a renovation or a residential or a commercial project? I think really asking yourself those questions will help you to, again, determine more information about what it is about that definition of who I want to work with and what I want to work on. And once you figure that out, I think you focus a lot of your business development energy then on repeating that, right? So that was a project that I really enjoyed working on. I realized it was not only just the client, it was also the type of work that I was doing, right? So you want to take that, you want to publish it everywhere that you can, you want to market it, you want to use that in all of your marketing materials, because you want to find those same types of clients that are looking to do the same thing and really direct that. And you might have to, I think what people generally get worried about, like in this idea of kind of niching down, is that there's not enough work out there that's like that. So that's where, again, you get to use your creative energy and decide, okay, well, is there not enough work in this immediate area? Do I need to expand my offering? Like, am I willing to drive a couple of hours or a few hours, to expand my reach, to work on projects that I'm really passionate about, but they're just a little bit further away? So there's no right or wrong answer, but these are, I think, conversations that either you should be having with yourself or with your partners on a regular basis to make sure that you're basically to make sure that you don't get burned out. In my opinion, that's really what it is. It's kind of a goal of not to get burned out, because it's really difficult to burn out, I think, if you're finding joy and you have passion on the projects that you're working in.
I'm just happy that the word burnout was used in like almost 40 minutes of our conversation. We are talking about working smarter, not harder as an architect. And I was really afraid that we will start with talking about burnouts and so on, but we are good to go. We waited enough. But still, I think that, I'm also talking about the burnout because this is my next question. And I wanted to talk about the second part of answering and giving this advice on how to work smarter, not harder as an architect, because there is a lot of thinking involved in this business development, right? So you need to really sit and think about what do you enjoy, what types of projects would you like to make. And after this whole process, you finally land a project and there is this project delivery phase. So how can firms and architects streamline their processes to avoid this burnout that you've just mentioned?
Yeah, and we should mention that I personally consider project delivery to be like a separate issue. It's not necessarily I think it's impacts business development, but it is like its own separate, almost like say field in a sense. You want to make sure that you're delivering great work because that makes business development a lot easier. So like that's the attachment, right? If you're delivering great work and projects that you enjoy, then it's going to give you a lot more fuel for your business development side of your practice. But for the project delivery side, it's really, how can firms streamline their processes to avoid burnout? Because burnout is a real issue. I don't know if you saw this, but Monograph did recently, like in the last month, like this month, they put out a report on burnout in architecture, and it's a crazy number they did. I think they surveyed over 250 architects, and 97% of them said that they experienced burnout in some capacity in the last year, which is very concerning. That's just not something. Basically, if you're an architect and you're listening to this and you're wondering whether or not your employees or your colleagues are experiencing burnout, they probably are. They probably are. They at least have, sometime recently. So rule number one with project delivery is that you can't improve something that you're not measuring, right? So how are you measuring project delivery? How are you tracking time? How are you managing your projects? How are you staffing those projects and building budgets and sending invoices? And are you doing it in a way that you can measure those results? That's really important because it's easy to kind of just like go with the flow. And then you don't generally find out whether you overworked your employees or whether you had a good profit margin on a project until it's over, or maybe even until like a month after it's over, because there's this delay in the payment process. I sadly speak to a lot of architects where I'm asking them how they know if their projects are profitable or how they know if they're profitable, and they answer by telling me that I look at my bank account. I see how much money I have in my bank account. That's crazy. That's so, that's such a passive way of understanding your firm's financial health, right? It's just like, where's the number at? I don't know. I hope that it's still positive. That's kind of nuts. There's a lot of different ways that you can track these things, right? You can do it with a pen and paper. You can build spreadsheets. Obviously, you can use a tool like Monograph, which makes it incredibly easy to do these things. That's not what I'm here to sell, but I mean, that is exactly what we focus on as helping firms have this information at their fingertips and use it in a way that helps them to optimize their processes and their time and their energy. But no matter what solution you do, it's really important that you're consistently evaluating that data, whether that's on a monthly or weekly, a monthly, a quarterly basis. You're going back and looking at the data that you have and saying, okay, where is there room for improvement? Is there an employee that's working way more time than they should be? Is there a project or a type of project that doesn't seem to give us the profit margin that we're looking for? And alternatively, like you also want to, you want to look at, what's not working and then find what is working. What types of projects are we getting our best profit margin on? And if that is also aligned with the projects that are bringing you, that you have a lot of passion for and a lot of joy, then you've hit gold. You've struck gold there, right? That's the perfect combination. But the idea is to look back at that and constantly, your firm and your practice really it's a living organism that constantly needs different types of, just like, I can only think of this analogy now because I have a son who's 15 months old, right? Who's always growing and always changing. And I just think of an architecture practice kind of in the same way. And if we think about specifically like fuel and food, right? Like my son is constantly, 1 week he likes a specific type of food. The next week he hates that one and he wants whatever the opposite of that type of food is, right? I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy how humans develop, but businesses can be the same way. Depending on how mature a business is or what stage of, its life cycle a business is in, there might be different types of fuel, different types of energy that business needs. And maybe it really needs to focus on, making sure if it's early stage, it really needs to focus on making sure that it's bringing in projects that are profitable, that after you hit a comfortable stage and you know that you have kind of reliable revenue, then you can really focus on making sure that your employees are not working more than 40 hours a week, right? And then you've maintained that and you've optimized those aspects. And it's like, okay, so what types of projects are we passionate about and are also bringing us, a good profit margin? And you can direct your energy that way. And then you can say, okay, now we have reliable revenue. We know our employees aren't overworking themselves, so we don't have to worry about burnout as much. We're working on projects that we're all passionate about. And now let's use this reliable revenue to give back to our employees, right? To give them better benefits, to give them more paid time off, to give them bonuses on the holidays, things like that will actually enrich and empower architects to, enjoy their lives and their careers a lot more, give them some work-life balance back.
Wow, Tyler, on behalf of my listeners, all the architects listening to that, I'm very thankful for this vast advice on how to basically work smarter and not harder. And I hope that it will really help the listeners to develop their careers towards that direction. I wanted to ask you for one more advice to conclude on that note. And I would like to focus especially on some advice for the younger professionals who are maybe just starting their careers or graduating from universities. And I just wanted to ask you for one tip. What would be your number one tip for architects, especially young ones, to be fulfilled in their job, in their company, in their career in general?
Yeah.
I know it's a very big question, but maybe there will be just this number one tip.
I love that you're asking it. I do love that you're asking it. I would say, well, you can tell, hopefully you can tell from the conversation that we've had today, I really believe in working on things that you're passionate about. I don't want to say follow your passion. I think that's way overused and it's also too general. No one really knows what that means. How do you follow your passion? I'm not entirely sure. But what I would say to young architects is to prioritize well-being. I think that's really important. In the same way, it's kind of if you know that working 60 hours a week is really unhealthy for you, then don't take a job where you know that you're going to be working 60 hours a week, no matter who it's for, no matter what it is, no matter what it pays. It's not worth it. Likewise, if you realize that you really enjoy working on a specific type of, it's kind of finding what it is that you enjoy working on and just directing your attention that way. I know that I'm really interested in residential design. So make sure that you find a residential architect to work with that you enjoy, that, if it's really important to you to work on large projects, then focus on those. Or If you realize that you want good health benefits, find a firm that has good health benefits. But I think it's just really important that we need to kind of just keep pushing this idea out there. We should be prioritizing our well-being, because I don't think architects are happy enough right now. I just don't think that they are. I speak to them all the time, and it's so rare to come across ones that just where they just have joy emitting from them. You know what I mean? Those types of people. We all have those types of people in our lives.
Yes.
And it's rarely an architect. And I think that's a problem. That's a problem. We should be much happier. We should be filled with so much more joy in the work that we're doing. And I think that's on us and it as individuals to kind of prioritize that. But I also think it's largely on the industry as a whole, on our employers and on the firms that we're working for and with.
I would like to disagree, but I can't on this particular note. I just really think that the joy is something extremely important. It's exactly what I'm doing right now that gives me joy, getting to know you and getting your kind of input and your perspective on this whole business development is something that is just fascinating to me. And there is one more thing. I would like to pick up your brain a bit more and ask for one last recommendation. But this time I would like to ask you for maybe a book or a report or something to read that you could share with the listeners that could also inspire them.
Yeah, I'm interested now because I'm assuming that you probably asked this to all of your podcast guests. I'm intrigued to know what this list looks like. So I'm not going to recommend any books that are specific to architecture, because if you've had 80 podcast guests up to this point, I'm sure that there isn't an architecture book out there that hasn't been recommended that's like super relevant, right? But mine are focused on, I have two I think worth mentioning, and they are focused more on like the business development side of things. One is $100 Million Offers by Alex Hormozi. I don't know if you've heard of this one or if you've read it or if you've seen it. It's actually really...
No, but I'm intrigued.
Yeah. It's really, it's not a super long book, but he's a really successful entrepreneur, and it's an amazing book on building value and increasing revenue for a business. And I think there's so many great tactics that can be translated to an architecture business. And specifically, like, I think as an architect reading that book, it really gets you thinking about what different things you can add to your offer, to your proposal, to add additional value for your client and also increase your fee. I think it's a really helpful book for that. And I think it's a useful exercise to run through. The other one is Gap Selling by Keenan. This gap selling concept is it's popular at the moment, and I actually do think it's really useful. I know I've posted about it a couple of times on LinkedIn, but it's this idea that whenever you're speaking to someone, so when you're speaking to a potential client, idea is that you're trying to find the gap in their current situation, and the gap is essentially the difference between where they are and where they want to be, right? And so once you identify that gap, you're able to navigate the conversation in such a way where you can, again, position yourself, position your firm, position your practice in the best way to kind of be the best solution for what their issue is and for that gap.
Tyler, thank you very much for over 50 minutes packed with enormously interesting knowledge. And I'm just feeling that we gave a lot of benefits to the listener, to the architect, and not only listening to us. And I hope that they will just also get inspired and they will think about their career, their health especially, and that they will prioritize their well-being, because this is something that just resonated with me as well. So thank you one more time for sharing all those thoughts you had.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity. And I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you for listening to the newest episode of Urbcast, and I hope that it was a very useful knowledge that you just learned from this episode. If you found this episode useful, please share it with your friends so they can also learn how to be more efficient as an architect. If you would like to listen to more episodes or support Urbcast in any way, please follow me on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, or just visit my website urbcast.pl/en. Thank you for listening one more time, and talk to you soon.